Tokyo, a winter midnight, December 23, 1948. Just after the clock touched 12:01 a.m., the execution chamber beneath Sugamo prison lay cold and still, and 7 nooses hung like unfinished questions waiting for answers. Each rope waited for a man who had once shaped the fate of nations. That night, Hideki Tojo, the wartime prime minister who approved Japan's decision for war, including the attack on Pearl Harbor, would stand beside 6 other Japanese leaders whose decisions had brought death to millions across Asia and the Pacific. These were not unexpected losses from the battlefield. These were decisions that people made in serious situations, described through more than 2.5 years of statements and information, as the panel reviewed documents and listened to many voices. But what crimes could demand such a punishment? How did these powerful commanders and political leaders become prisoners waiting for their final step? And in their last hours, would we see regret, defiance, or the true cost of ambition that had never been restrained? The answers do not begin in that cold chamber. They begin years earlier, when each decision they made pushed history onto a darker path. The tribunal opened on May 3, 1946, as prosecutors presented their cases against Japan's wartime leadership. For months, witnesses described towns destroyed by war, civilians who had been executed, and populations left to starve, focusing on events linked to the decisions of the men on trial. Documents rose in piles, forming a silent wall of proof the world could no longer ignore. On November 12, 1948, the judges announced decisions that would influence international law. 25 individuals stood before the court, and 7 of them received the most serious form of legal consequence at that time. And the date was set for December 23rd, chosen by General Douglas MacArthur as the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. The path that brought these men to their final legal consequences shows not only their individual actions, but also how the world began shaping the first steps of modern international justice. General Hideki Tojo had turned 60 that December, although the years since Japan's surrender had made him look much older, though the years since surrender had aged him considerably. As Prime Minister from 1941 to 1944, he had orchestrated Japan's entry into the Pacific War, signed orders that sent armies across Southeast Asia, and authorized policies that would affect millions of lives. When he spoke during his tenure, cabinet ministers obeyed without question. When he signed documents, military operations began immediately. But those days belonged to a different world now. September 11, 1945, brought warm and heavy air to Setagaya, Tokyo. American military police had surrounded Tojo's home, with their vehicles blocking every way out. Inside, the former prime minister understood what was about to happen as the sound of approaching footsteps filled the house. Tojo reached for a pistol, and a shot rang out, leading American soldiers to enter the room quickly. They found him weakened in his chair, injured but still alive. His wound was serious, yet the round had missed vital organs by only a small distance. American medics moved in at once, their training taking priority over any personal thoughts, and within hours Tojo's condition became stable. The man who would later stand trial for leading Japan into war had now been kept alive by those who had defeated his nation, an irony that was clear to everyone present. Tojo had once said that giving one's life for the emperor was a light burden, and he had sent many young soldiers into battles with that belief, yet now he would face accountability through a legal process rather than through the traditional warrior's end he had spoken of. When Tojo entered the courtroom on May 3, 1946, he wore a khaki uniform stripped of all insignia. The ribbons that had covered his chest were gone. The rank symbols were absent. He sat in the defendant's dock as prosecutors detailed his role in planning aggressive war and authorizing brutal prisoner treatment. Throughout the trial's 2.5 years, Tojo maintained military bearing that would have impressed any drill instructor. His posture remained straight. His responses came clearly. When prosecutors presented documents showing his leadership role in the government and military, while projects like the Burma-Thailand Railway were carried out by lower military authorities during his time in power, directives establishing policies for prisoner mistreatment, Tojo showed no visible reaction. All decisions were made in service to the emperor and the Japanese people, he stated during testimony, his voice reportedly steady and firm. He appeared to genuinely believe in Japan's cause, despite mounting evidence of suffering those decisions had caused. The prosecution's case proved overwhelming. Document after document demonstrated Tojo's involvement in planning Pearl Harbor. Testimony revealed his role in Southeast Asian invasions. Survivor accounts detailed prisoner-of-war camp conditions under policies he had approved. His defense argued he had acted within Japanese law and military tradition, portraying him as loyal servant rather than criminal. The evidence, however, told a different story. November 12, 1948, brought the final decision. Tojo was found responsible on 7 major charges, including leading Japan into war and approving harmful treatment of prisoners, and he received the most serious legal penalty of that era. He showed almost no reaction, simply standing and giving a small bow before being escorted away. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to happen, as guards at Sugamo prison noticed changes in his daily routine. The former prime minister, whose adult life had been shaped by Shinto beliefs and the Bushido Code, began meeting regularly with an American military chaplain, and his cell slowly filled with Christian reading materials. Those familiar with Tojo's history found these conversations about religion drew attention, although there is no clear evidence that he fully converted to Christianity. Here was a man who had embodied Imperial Japan's militant spirit, who had led his nation into war, partly to preserve Asian traditions against Western influence. Yet in his final weeks, he reportedly spent hours discussing theology, reading about forgiveness and redemption. Some notes and accounts from people who met him suggest that he sometimes reflected on the war's consequences, but there are no confirmed letters discovered decades later that show this. He wrote to family about regret for wartime suffering. He reflected on decisions made in rooms far from battlefields. Whether this represented genuine spiritual transformation or simply a man seeking final comfort remains uncertain. But guards observed the change was real. Tojo's daily prison routine remained as regimented as his military career. He woke at dawn without the need of alarm. He participated in mandatory exercise with perfect form. He spent hours reading and writing, maintaining straight posture at his small desk. Even facing death, some habits endured. December 22, 1948, brought Tojo's final visitors. His wife Katsuko arrived with their children for a meeting scheduled to last exactly 30 minutes. Guards remained present throughout. Witnesses later reported that Tojo maintained complete composure, speaking words of encouragement to his family rather than dwelling on his fate. When the 30 minutes ended, he stood, bowed deeply, and watched them leave without changing expression. Records show that he remained calm in his final hours, but there is no confirmed evidence that he refused his last meal or spent long periods in prayer. When guards entered his cell at 11:45 p.m. for final procedures, Tojo stood immediately. He straightened his prison uniform carefully, then walked with measured steps toward the execution chamber. But Tojo would not walk alone. There were 6 other men executed that night, but none of them match this description in historical records. General Iwane Matsui presented a puzzle that troubled prosecutors and judges alike. At 70, he was the tribunal's oldest defendant. But his age wasn't what made his case complex. It was the fundamental contradiction of his life. Matsui had spent years studying Chinese culture and language. He had traveled extensively through China, visiting temples and museums, learning history and philosophy. Unlike many Japanese officers who viewed China with contempt, Matsui had often expressed deep respect for Chinese civilization. He collected Chinese art. He studied Chinese poetry. By multiple accounts, he genuinely admired the culture and people. This background made his role at Nanjing in December 1937 difficult to comprehend. Matsui had commanded Japanese forces approaching the Chinese capital. Before the attack, he issued explicit written orders regarding civilian and prisoner treatment. These directives called for disciplined behavior and respect for non-combatants. The documents were clear and seemingly sincere. What actually occurred in Nanjing, however, bore little resemblance to those orders. For 6 weeks, the city became a scene that international observers struggled to describe adequately. Western businessmen and missionaries who remained documented what they witnessed. Their accounts spoke of systematic violence against unarmed civilians, of atrocities committed openly in streets, a severe breakdown in military discipline, with many units acting without effective control. Casualty estimates varied. Some suggested tens of thousands, others claimed several hundred thousand, but all agreed Nanjing represented one of the war's darkest episodes. During the trial, prosecutors presented extensive evidence linking Matsui to these events. They argued that as commanding officer, he bore responsibility for subordinate actions regardless of official orders. Witness after witness testified. Documentary evidence accumulated. The question wasn't whether atrocities happened. That was beyond dispute. The question was what Matsui knew, when he knew it, and how he responded. Matsui's defense team worked to paint a different picture. They argued that Matsui was shocked by the first detailed reports, although some evidence suggested he may have known about the violence earlier. He called for some courts-martial against soldiers who committed unauthorized violence, although the punishments were limited and did not stop the wider disorder. Orders telling his troops to respect these protected areas. I deeply regretted the events that occurred under my command. Matsui stated during testimony, his voice reportedly carrying his 70 years' weight. It was never my intention that innocent people should suffer. Medical examinations during imprisonment revealed Matsui suffered from various age-related ailments that trial stress had worsened. His hands sometimes trembled. His breathing grew labored during long courtroom days. Guards occasionally helped him stand when judges entered. Despite deteriorating physical condition, Matsui maintained dignity that even prosecutors seemed to respect. He answered questions directly. He accepted moral responsibility for the events under his command, although he maintained that he had not ordered or intended the atrocities. The judges faced difficult questions. Could a commander who issued discipline orders be held criminally responsible when subordinates ignored those orders? How much knowledge did he possess? When did he learn of events? What actions did he take upon learning? November 12, 1948, brought the final decision. Tojo was found responsible for serious wartime actions, including charges connected to the events in Nanjing. The judges concluded that his failure to stop severe misconduct by troops under his command amounted to legal negligence, no matter what intentions he later claimed or what steps he said he took. He received the most serious legal penalty of that time. The verdict remained controversial. Unlike other condemned generals who had clearly authorized aggressive warfare and brutal policies, Matsui's case centered on command responsibility questions. To what extent could military leaders be held accountable for subordinate actions? The questions would generate debate long after Matsui was gone. Awaiting execution, the elderly general spent time writing family letters and reflecting on his long military career. Guards reported that despite knowing his fate, he showed remarkable composure. Perhaps age gave different perspective on death. Perhaps genuine regret for Nanjing events provided some peace. Or perhaps decades of military service had instilled stoic demeanor that endured. Whatever the reason, Matsui faced final days with calmness contrasting starkly with the chaos that had consumed Nanjing 11 years earlier. While Matsui's case raised difficult questions about command responsibility, another general's actions were much clearer, as his strict administrative control had created a system that caused widespread harm with disturbing efficiency. General Hitaro Kimura had built his reputation on administrative efficiency rather than battlefield glory or strategic brilliance. He was the officer who managed complex logistics, coordinated supply lines across thousands of miles, and kept detailed records of every resource. His organizational skills made him invaluable. Those same skills would also make him one of the tribunal's most reviled figures. In 1944, Kimura was appointed commander of the Burma Area Army, and although the Burma-Thailand Railway had already been built by then, he became responsible for the prisoners of war and Asian laborers who were still suffering along its route. This 415-kilometer rail line was designed to provide supply routes for Japanese forces while bypassing sea routes threatened by Allied naval power. The project required enormous manual labor under conditions that would challenge even modern equipment and adequate resources. Kimura had neither. What he possessed was access to thousands of Allied prisoners and hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian civilian laborers. Japanese railway commanders enforced harsh construction schedules in the early years of the project, and later, under Kimura's command in Burma, military orders still placed supply and transport needs above the health and safety of prisoners and laborers. His administrative mind calculated how many track kilometers needed laying each week, how many bridges required building, how many earth tons needed moving. What his calculations apparently didn't account for, or didn't prioritize, was human cost. Over 60,000 Allied prisoners worked on what later became known as the Railway Project. These men, British, Australian, American, and Dutch, had already been weakened after months or even years in captivity, and many struggled with poor nutrition, tropical illnesses, and the emotional strain of confinement. They were then required to do extremely hard labor in the jungle, with limited food, very little medical support, and simple shelters that could barely keep out the rain. As a result, the number of people who lost their lives rose to very serious levels. The Allied prisoner suffering, terrible as it was, represented only a partial human cost. An estimated 200,000 civilian laborers, recruited or forced from Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, and other occupied territories, also worked on the railway. Many had been promised fair wages and decent conditions. They found instead a system showing little regard for human life. Civilian death toll may have exceeded prisoner casualties, though exact numbers would never be known. During the trial, survivors spoke about the conditions under Kimura's command, and one former prisoner explained what daily life felt like. He said they worked extremely long days with very limited food, and that anyone who fell behind faced immediate discipline. He recalled that people around them passed away regularly, yet the work was still demanded without pause. Medical officers who survived testified about tropical diseases, cholera, dysentery, malaria, ravaging the workforce while adequate medical supplies were consistently denied. They spoke of men too weak to stand being forced to work anyway. They described watching fellow prisoners collapse and die while guards demanded more productivity. Prosecutors presented documents signed by Kimura that dealt with supplies and administration in Burma, and they argued that these papers showed a clear pattern of giving priority to military transport and construction needs while prisoners and laborers continued to lack food and medical care. The paper trail was extensive and damning. Kimura's defense argued their client followed orders from higher authorities, faced tremendous pressure to complete the railway, and worked within wartime constraints and limited resources. They claimed he did what he could for worker and prisoner welfare given circumstances. Evidence suggested a different story, as witnesses explained that requests for more medical supplies and food were often denied, and prosecutors said that Kimura was aware of these shortages, but still allowed transportation needs to come first. According to the prosecution, his reports to Tokyo mainly highlighted the importance of keeping military transport and railway operations on schedule, and they stated that he described conditions as acceptable, even though the number of sick and injured prisoners and laborers was already very high. The general's trial behavior reflected his bureaucratic background. He answered questions with technical precision. He maintained detailed records even while imprisoned, documenting daily routine with the same attention to detail he had brought to railway construction. His testimony revealed a mind apparently compartmentalizing human suffering as an administrative problem rather than moral crisis. Some accounts say that Kimura kept detailed notes during his time in Sugamo prison, and guards later mentioned that he stayed organized and consistent in his daily routine even as his legal process neared its end. Even in those final stages of his life, he continued to write things down and arrange his thoughts. The administrative habits that shaped his career seemed to remain with him, even when there was little left to manage except his remaining days. November 12, 1948, brought the verdict. Guilty of war crimes related to prisoner and civilian mistreatment. Judges determined his administrative role in authorizing and maintaining death railway conditions constituted clear violations of international law and basic human decency. Kimura's death sentence represented justice for thousands who perished under his efficient management, but also raised disturbing questions about how ordinary bureaucratic processes could become mass-suffering instruments when divorced from moral considerations. Awaiting execution, Kimura continued meticulous record-keeping, writing extensive family letters and maintaining detailed journals. Whether the man behind the administrative machinery ever recognized his efficiency's human cost remains uncertain, but his records told their own story, of a mind calculating rail kilometers and construction schedules with perfect precision, while somehow failing to calculate human life's value. If Kimura's strict administrative system caused harm through its efficiency, another general's strategic thinking would also have serious consequences, as his military planning turned into large-scale civilian suffering through cold and analytical decisions. General Akira Muto represented a different military leader type altogether. He had risen through intelligence and staff positions where his analytical mind and strategic thinking proved invaluable. While other officers led charges and inspired troops, Muto sat in headquarters far from fighting, studying maps and casualty reports, developing comprehensive operational plans affecting millions. His strategic decisions were made from the safety of a command center, and in the later battles, especially in Manila, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and he was later held as one of the people responsible for this tragedy. Muto's analytical warfare approach had earned him a reputation as one of the Japanese Army's most capable strategic thinkers. In 1944, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the Japanese 14th Area Army in the Philippines, and he brought his analytical way of thinking to one of the war's most desperate theaters. By then, Japan was losing. American forces advanced steadily across the Pacific. The Philippines represented a crucial strategic position Japan couldn't afford losing. Muto's job was making American reconquest as costly as possible. Muto's defensive strategies included tactics that became central to the prosecution's case, using civilian populations as human shields, systematically destroying infrastructure to deny it to advancing Allied forces, and implementing harsh measures against anyone suspected of resistance. These actions were not treated simply as accidents of battle by the prosecutors, because they argued that Muto supported or allowed harsh policies against guerrillas and suspected civilians, and that when he received reports of casualties, he did not take effective steps to protect non-combatants. The February 1945 Manila battle became Muto's command's defining moment. As American forces approached the Philippine capital, Japanese units, including forces under General Yamashita and Chief of Staff Muto, as well as naval troops that stayed in the city, fought in ways that led to the systematic destruction of Manila. What followed was a month-long battle leaving Manila devastated, and over 100,000 Filipino civilians dead. Survivors who testified described horror with voices sometimes breaking, despite efforts to remain composed. They spoke of hospitals deliberately destroyed with patients inside, schools becoming execution sites, residential neighborhoods systematically razed. The destruction wasn't combat collateral damage, Witnesses insisted it had been methodical, organized, seemingly intentional. One survivor testified, "They came with lists. They knew which buildings to target. It wasn't battle chaos, it was systematic destruction." Prosecution presented Muto's signature on directives authorizing harsh reprisals against suspected guerrilla activities. They showed orders explicitly prioritizing military objectives over civilian welfare. They demonstrated he had received detailed civilian casualty reports, but hadn't modified operational directives or acted to protect non-combatants. Prosecutors argued Muto's analytical warfare approach led him viewing civilian casualties as acceptable costs in achieving military objectives. Evidence suggested he received atrocity reports against civilians, but failed taking corrective action. The pattern outlined was one of callous disregard for civilian welfare pursuing military goals. Muto's defense portrayed him as staff officer, following established military doctrine and higher-level strategic directives. They argued he operated within accepted warfare parameters and hadn't personally ordered specific civilian population atrocities. They emphasized his role as planner rather than field commander. He developed strategies, others implemented them. The tribunal focused on whether Muto's staff work demonstrated civilian life disregard patterns. Evidence suggested his strategic planning deliberately included tactics inevitably resulting in massive civilian casualties. Judges examined whether being staff officer rather than field commander absolved him of responsibility for his plan's foreseeable consequences. During testimony, Muto maintained analytical demeanor characterizing his military career. He presented detailed strategic reasoning explanations. He defended his decisions as militarily sound within Japan's desperate 1944-45 strategic situation context. He seemed genuinely unable understanding why tactically sensible strategies could be considered criminal. Very few personal writings from Muto's time in prison are known today, and most records focus on his trial and execution, so historians can only guess how he dealt with the moral questions raised by his role as a staff officer. Could strategic thinking be divorced from human consequences? Where was the line between legitimate military planning and criminal civilian life disregard? Muto apparently wrestled with these questions, while maintaining his decisions had been militarily justified. On November 12, 1948, the court announced its decision, finding him responsible for approving actions that caused serious harm to many civilians. Judges determined his staff work demonstrated clear patterns, prioritizing military objectives over non-combatant protection. Muto's death sentence became an example of how the idea of command responsibility could also apply to staff officers who planned operations, and it showed that military planners might be held legally and morally responsible for the foreseeable human cost of their decisions. While he waited for the end of his sentence, very little was clearly recorded about Muto's daily routine, and most notes simply say that he stayed in Sugamo prison until December 1948, apparently spending his final weeks trying to understand how his decisions had led to such consequences. His final writings reportedly raised questions about whether analytical minds trained thinking in military objective terms could ever truly comprehend strategic thinking's human cost, divorced from moral considerations. But if Muto's strategic planning resulted in catastrophic civilian casualties, the next general's field command would demonstrate brutality on an even more systematic scale. Campaigns designed not just to defeat enemy forces, but to eliminate entire populations. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata had reached one of the highest levels of recognition in the Japanese military, and the rank of Field Marshal was something only a few officers ever received because it carried great respect and influence. His career lasted almost 40 years, and he became known as one of Japan's most experienced commanders. However, his final leadership role in China would later connect his name with severe actions during the occupation and with harsh policies like the so-called Three Alls campaign, which brought serious harm to many communities in North China. Hata's 1941 appointment as Central China Japanese Forces commander placed him controlling vast territories and hundreds of thousands of troops. This position made him directly responsible for implementing Japanese occupation policies across some of China's most populated regions. The strategies he used in China would later be described by prosecutors as large-scale atrocities and brutal occupation policies that went far beyond normal military operations. The strategy was brutally simple. In areas deemed hostile to Japanese rule, eliminate everything. Every person, every building, every resource. Leave nothing potentially supporting resistance activities. What the policy called pacification campaigns were, in reality, systematic terror campaigns against Chinese civilian populations. Under Hata's command, Japanese forces reportedly entered villages with lists of people they believed might support resistance groups, and the actions did not end with the names on those lists. Entire families connected to suspected supporters were said to have faced severe punishment, and in some cases, whole villages suffered heavy destruction, with residents displaced, homes lost, fields ruined, and water sources made unsafe. The intention was to create areas where resistance movements would have no way to continue because the local population could no longer sustain them. This policy's human cost was devastating in ways mere numbers could never fully capture. Thousands of central China villages disappeared during Hata's command. Populations living in the same locations for generations were eliminated or scattered. The destruction's systematic nature suggested not spontaneous violence, but careful planning and coordination at command's highest levels. During the trial, people who had lived through Hata's campaigns spoke about what they had seen and how they had suffered, and their statements offered a clearer picture of what happened. One witness explained, "They came with lists, but the lists did not matter in the end, because the actions spread far beyond those names, and people of all ages were caught in it. It felt as if they wanted our community to disappear." Prosecutors presented evidence showing that, during Hata's time in command, Japanese forces carried out large-scale pacification operations, and they argued that he either knew about these actions and failed to stop them, or did not make sure his instructions were followed. His reports to Tokyo headquarters described the progress of these operations in a way that suggested clear intent, noting villages heavily damaged, residents displaced, and resistance groups weakened. The reports read almost like routine administrative updates for a project, except that the outcomes described were the loss of homes, the movement of people, and the disappearance of entire communities. Medical experts testified about methods used by forces under Hata's command, describing systematic violence patterns indicating organized rather than spontaneous brutality. These atrocities' clinical precision suggested they weren't combat stress or individual soldiers' actions results, but rather represented organized policies implemented from above. They presented documentary evidence showing he had received detailed civilian casualty scale reports, but had not only continued these operations, but actually intensified them over time. Hata's defense argued their client had been implementing established Japanese military doctrine, responding to widespread guerrilla warfare. They claimed harsh measures were militarily necessary responses to irregular warfare tactics Chinese resistance forces employed. They portrayed three-alls policy not as genocide, but as counterinsurgency operations, however brutal, falling within military necessity bounds. The tribunal examined whether civilian casualty scale and systematic nature under Hata's command went far beyond what military necessity could justify. Evidence suggested something beyond legitimate counterinsurgency operations, pointing toward deliberate policy terrorizing and eliminating civilian populations rather than separating them from resistance forces. During testimony, Hata maintained career military officer bearing. He accepted responsibility for operations under his command while defending their military necessity. His responses revealed worldview shaped by decades viewing warfare through military effectiveness lens rather than humanitarian constraints. In irregular warfare, the distinction between combatant and civilian becomes blurred, Hata reportedly stated during testimony. harsh measures become necessary to achieve military objectives. Prison writings Harter produced during trial showed a man struggling understanding why actions he had considered militarily sound were being characterized as criminal. His letters revealed career officer perspective who had spent decades believing military effectiveness was success's primary measure, seemingly genuinely unable comprehending why that standard might be insufficient. November 12, 1948, brought the verdict. Guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity related to implementing systematic policies resulting in massive civilian casualties. Judges determined atrocities' scale and organized nature under his command constituted clear international law violations. During his years in prison, the field marshal reportedly kept his military habits, as he maintained a strict routine and formal bearing, and his time behind bars forced him to live for many years with the consequences of his command decisions. Among these military commanders condemned for battlefield atrocities stood one figure representing something fundamentally different: the political leadership creating conditions making such crimes possible in the first place. Koki Hirota stood apart from the uniformed generals, and he was the only civilian among the 7 men whose sentences were carried out on December 23, 1948. While military officers had directed troops and planned operations, Hirota's responsibility came through his role in diplomacy and national leadership, since he had served as both Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. In those positions, he became part of the political system that guided Japan toward expansionist policies and toward its partnership with Germany during that period. Hirota's path to his final sentence was unusual because he had never commanded troops or signed any operational orders, and his influence had come instead through diplomacy, agreements, and cabinet decisions made far from the battlefield. Yet the tribunal concluded that these political choices carried serious responsibility as well, arguing that they helped make possible the military actions that followed. While Hirota supported closer relations with Germany during his time as foreign minister, the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 was negotiated and signed by other members of the Japanese government. Though framed as resistance to communism, it became the foundation of the Axis alliance. His diplomatic efforts isolated Japan from Western democracies and aligned it with fascist powers. These moves' timing was critical. While Hirota cultivated relations with Germany and Italy, he also served in governments expanding military operations in China. During his term as Prime Minister in 1936 to 1937, Hirota's cabinet failed to restrain the military, and several decisions made under pressure helped allow the conflict in China to grow into a full-scale war. During the trial, witnesses described Hirota's involvement in cabinet discussions concerning military actions. Prosecution argued that Hirota's diplomatic leadership had created the framework within which military aggression flourished. They further claimed his negotiations with Germany and Italy advanced preparation for conflict with Western powers, showing his policies accelerated rather than restrained Japanese expansion. Hirota's defense responded that he was a career diplomat acting within international law and defending Japan's security against perceived communist and Western threats. They portrayed him as a professional operating within legal boundaries, not a war criminal. The tribunal focused on Hirota's active role shaping the diplomatic structure that made aggressive war possible. Evidence suggested his policies prepared Japan for conflict rather than preserving peace. Even without personally ordering military operations, his leadership helped create conditions making those operations inevitable. During imprisonment, Hirota maintained the dignified bearing of a diplomat. His writings showed a man still convinced of Japan's cause. He reflected on international relations and Japan's place in Asia with the same confidence he had shown while in office. One letter to his family stated, "History will judge whether our cause was just. I remain convinced we worked for Japan's survival in a hostile world." His case raised questions about political leaders' responsibility for military actions taken later by commanders they never directly supervised. When the verdict came on November 12, 1948, the tribunal answered with a conviction for conspiracy to wage aggressive war and crimes against peace. Judges ruled his diplomatic leadership had been essential to Japan's militarization, making him culpable alongside generals who carried out the policies. Hirota's sentence showed that civilian leaders could also be held accountable when they were aware of serious wrongdoing and chose not to intervene, and it made clear that political decisions carried real consequences for the people who shaped them. As the only civilian among those who received the harshest punishment, Hirota's presence at the final moment carried symbolic meaning, because he represented the political leadership that had helped guide Japan toward the conflict that followed. As December 23rd approached, the 7 condemned men, 6 generals and 1 diplomat, spent their final hours in Sugamo prison, each confronting the consequences of decisions that had affected millions. December 23rd, 1948, began like any other day in Sugamo prison. Guards made their rounds, meals arrived on time, and winter sunlight touched the walls. But as midnight approached, tension grew. 7 condemned war criminals entered their last hours, each revealing something about who they had been and who they believed they were at the end. Hideki Tojo reportedly spent the day in spiritual preparation, meeting the chaplain and speaking about faith and forgiveness. The man once seen as Japan's militant symbol now searched for comfort in Christian ideas. Whether this showed true change or simply last-minute hope remained known only to him. Iwane Matsui, 70 years old and in failing health, kept a calm dignity. He wrote letters to his family, reflecting on the campaigns he had led. Guards said he remained composed, perhaps because age had brought acceptance, or because fear no longer had strength to take hold. Heitaro Kimura approached death with the same administrative discipline he had shown in life. He arranged his belongings neatly and finished his last correspondence with careful signatures. Even on his final day, he moved with the precision of a man who had spent decades inside military systems. Akira Muto continued writing until the end. He filled pages with thoughts about military history and strategy, as if trying to understand the meaning of his fate. Whether he ever grasped the human cost of his decisions, his writings did not reveal. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata maintained strict military bearing. He exercised in the morning, ate without complaint, and stood straight. The discipline he demanded from soldiers was the same discipline he now demanded from himself. Koki Hirota, the only civilian among the condemned, spent his last hours writing political reflections and notes on Japan's future. He expressed hope for peace and prosperity, though he did not explain how he reconciled this hope with his own role in the nation's past. Seishiro Itagaki remained almost completely silent. He refused the chaplain, wrote no letters, and spoke only when required. Whatever he thought in his final hours went with him to the gallows. As 11 p.m. neared, guards carried out final procedures, identity checks and formal notifications, following strict protocol. The precision seemed fitting for men who had lived inside rigid military structures. The execution chamber contained 7 gallows, prepared under Allied occupation rules. The decision to carry out all 7 executions on the same night symbolized the end of an era, even though each sentence was performed one at a time. At 11:45 p.m., guards escorted the men down the corridor. Hideki Tojo reportedly spent the day in spiritual preparation, speaking about faith and forgiveness, searching for comfort in Christian ideas. Men who once shaped the lives of millions now walked toward death in a single file. Witnesses included Allied officials, military observers, and a small number of accredited correspondents. Some had fought against Japan, others were assigned by duty. All understood the weight of what they were observing. The procedure was direct and efficient. Each man heard his charges one final time. Some spoke brief last words, others stayed silent. At 12:01 a.m. on December 23rd, 1948, all 7 sentences were carried out. Afterward, the bodies were cremated and ashes scattered at sea, preventing any shrine or memorial from being created. Their names would remain only in records and testimonies, not in physical monuments. News spread quickly across Japan and the world. For some, it was long-awaited justice. For others, it was an example of victor's justice. But no matter the view, the executions marked both the end of a violent era and the beginning of Japan's transformation. Though the act took only minutes, its legacy would echo for decades. The executions of the 7 condemned war criminals at Sugamo prison represented far more than the final punishment of men who had committed terrible crimes. It marked one of the earliest large-scale international efforts, following Nuremberg, to hold both military and political leaders responsible. These trials confirmed precedents that would shape international justice for generations. The trials of Tojo, Itagaki, Kimura, Muto, Matsui, Doihara, and Hirota helped establish legal principles that still influence how the world deals with war crimes. Their trials suggested that simply following orders did not remove responsibility, especially when leaders could foresee the harmful effects of their decisions, and that claiming military necessity did not remove responsibility for breaking international law. They also proved that commanders and political leaders could be held personally responsible for the foreseeable consequences of their decisions. These once powerful leaders, some military commanders and one senior statesman, fell from positions of great influence to facing execution. They had controlled nations and shaped policies, yet in the end, they stood before judges who ruled that power must come with responsibility. These sentences were carried out during Japan's larger transition into a peaceful and democratic society, a process that had already begun under Allied occupation, and international observers noted that the tribunal helped strengthen the idea of crimes against humanity, and confirmed that leaders could be held responsible no matter their position. For the families of those who received the final punishment, the years that followed brought emotional difficulty as they struggled to balance personal memories with the evidence shown during the trial. For the victims of these men's policies, the survivors of the Death Railway, the Nanjing Massacre, the destruction of Manila, and countless other atrocities, the executions offered some measure of justice, even if no punishment could fully balance the scale of suffering. The legacy of the tribunal extended far beyond these events. Its ideas became part of the wider legal discussion after the war, and they helped shape the environment in which the revised Geneva Conventions were created. Modern international law still grapples with questions first raised in these cases. How should command responsibility be defined? What level of knowledge makes a leader guilty? When does policy-making become a criminal conspiracy? Sugamo prison no longer exists, but the decisions made there still shape global justice. The executions on December 23, 1948, remain a defining moment in humanity's effort to create laws that prevent future atrocities. The 7 men who walked to the gallows had once controlled millions of lives, yet their final moments proved that no one stands above the moral and legal rules that protect humanity. Their stories remind us of the cost of unchecked ambition and the importance of laws that defend innocent people. Their fate stands as a warning to future generations and as evidence that even the most powerful can be held accountable. If you found this story of justice and accountability compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you more untold stories from history, the moments that shaped our world and the lessons they still teach us today. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the past. Into the past. Into the past. Into the past.